Oh, those are cool glasses.
They are cool glasses. She has a variety of cool glasses. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Del City Library. To all you Zoom participants, we do have some guests here in person. And my name is Tracy Randolph. I'm the manager here at the Del City Library in Oklahoma. And I am really excited this morning that we are able to host this program with our celebrity guests. Nicka Sewell-Smith. I am going to share her bio with you, which is very impressive. I could go on and on beyond the bio, but I'll stick to the bio. So Nicka Smith is a host, consultant, and documentarian with more than 20 years of experience as a genealogist. She has extensive experience in researching the enslaved and their communities and is a valued expert in genealogy research along the Mississippi Delta. Nicka has a diverse and varied experience in media with a background in audio, video, and written communications. She's appeared on The Today Show, CNN, MSNBC, and was featured on an Emmy-winning episode of the series, Who Do You Think You Are?, and has been interviewed by the Oakland Tribune, The Undefeated, National Geographic, and Time. She is the host of Black ProGen Live, and an innovative web show with more than 130 episodes focused on people of color, genealogy, and family history. She's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, a member of two lineage societies, Sons and Daughters of the Middle Passage, and the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and a past board member of the California Genealogical Society and the African American Genealogical Society of Northern California. Nicka served as the chair of the Outreach and Education Committee for AAGSSNC and is the former project manager for the Alameda County, California Youth Ancestral Project, where more than 325 youth were taught the value of family history. Additionally, Nicka is the family historian and lead researcher for the Atlas family of Lake Providence, East Carroll, Louisiana, and guides and coaches an active group of family historians at the Who Is Nicka Smith Patreon community. I'm also going to share with you, I am a member of the Atlas family, and Nicka is my cousin, and I'm really excited that she agreed to do this program for us today. For those of you on Zoom, I do have some updated information I will be emailing you for some future programs that we're going to be hosting. And I think that's all I have to share. So you will be very engaged in this presentation. I guarantee you will learn something to take back to your family. You will get excited about doing your own family history. Use your public library. We have a lot of free resources in our library system, and I'm sure where you all live that you have resources. Use your library. There's other local resources that you probably have access to that you may not be aware of that are free that you don't need to pay for. So I'm going to turn it over to Nicka, and we can all do a round of applause on Zoom. If you can applause with your reactions, I'd appreciate that too.
We have one other Atlas in the Zoom space. Our cousin Kyra in North Carolina, Tracy, is on with us too. Right. It seems like whenever we do this, there's always a Rosby and an Atlas in the same space, whether we're in California, right, or not.
And I'll be monitoring the chat. So if anybody has questions, I'll be watching the chat. I believe we have another cousin from Virginia. Colonel Tony Atlas is going to be joining us, I believe. So the Atlas family is here and represented, and I will turn everything over to Nicka. And welcome to everybody here in person. We've got some people trickling in. So it's all on you. Go for it, Nicka.
Right. Yeah. Turn your computer if you can. If not, I would love to hear feedback and stuff for people in the room, just because I know I want to be mindful of who's there. Hi, you all look wonderful this morning. It's good to see you. All right. So it's great that we actually started in this way. The reason why I say that is all of the cousins that we just shouted out, had I not pursued researching my family history outside of the confines of the people I knew, I would never know any of these people, like at all. And we are a very broad and expansive family. We live in about 30 states and 5 countries. And the only way I know that information is because we all just somehow end up in the same spaces at the same time. And people are all asking the same questions around who our ancestors are and where do we get this interesting last name, Atlas. It's very strange for a Black family to have that kind of a last name. So that's typically how we all find each other. But thanks for taking time out of your morning to be with me. In the words of many preachers in our community, I won't be before you long. But I do have a lot of information to share. Those of you who are in the Zoom space, be sure to be my energy today. I want to make sure you all are getting what you need out of this session. So actively use the chat that's available to you. Whether you want to throw tomatoes at me, if you want to ask questions, if you want to have banter, there's feedback or a comment that you want to make, definitely use that space. That's what it's there for. As well as those of you who are in the room, you know, if you have a question or something arises that you know that you want to ask, definitely be sure to do that. I am the type of person that I don't hold all questions until the end. So if you want to ask it, because I personally will forget. Somebody will keep going, I'll forget what I was going to ask. And then when it gets to questions, I don't remember what it is. So be sure you can stop me at any time to do that. All right. Good morning. Good morning. Oh, one last thing. I'll actually be in Oklahoma in 2 weeks. So for those of you who are there, I'll be presenting twice on behalf of the Cherokee Nation, one time in Veneta, and then again, that's on the 16th, and then again on the 18th at the Cherokee National Museum in Tahlequah. So if you want to come and learn a little bit more or a lot more about researching freedmen of the 5 tribes or researching Cherokee Nation freedmen, please be sure to check out that program. You can get to that visit CherokeeNation.com/events. So yeah, all right, let's go ahead and get started. Oh, Trace, you got to give me sharing capability or make me a co-host. I know, and this is typical us. She's talking to herself. That's what we do.
I always
So
forget
while we wait,
where is that at?
Okay, participants, and then
Oh.
and then hover over my name and then do more. And if you make me a co-host, that'll give me all the powers of Grayskull. For those of you that remember good old He-Man from the 80s, or She-Ra, depending on which one you watched. I watched both. Perfect. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay. So we're going to get started with a little description of what we're going to be talking about today. The interest in family history has grown so much. I mean, I could literally sit here and do an entire presentation talking about how people, how my world, my little nerdy world is no longer my little world anymore, and how it has grown so much, at least over the last decade plus. In this session, you're going to learn the basics of genealogy research. And I want to point out that you're going to learn the basics of genealogy because people think that you have to buy a special computer with a special keyboard, or you have to speak a special language, or you have to run around and run a marathon 5 times in order for you to trace enslaved people or Black people. That's not, no. If you have the basics of genealogy, period, you can research any people, period. Now, there are some intricacies when you get to certain time periods, but that exists for everybody. So you're going to be able to get basic skills in your genealogy research. You're going to see some of the ways that both free people and the formerly enslaved are reflected in documents, and how a little bit about how we use DNA currently to help us with our family history research. All right, so basics. I love all these kids. I wonder where they are. And God bless moms that had to comb all this hair. My mom was one of them. I have a son, so I'm so glad that that was not me. Either way, years ago, when you saw advertisements for genealogy in family history on television or even online, the ads looked very similar to this beautiful woman holding this photo of her ancestor on the left-hand side. And the ancestor whose photo that she is holding is a great-grandparent who was a chef. And during this ad, she is remaking a dish that he made. It's kind of like she was paying homage to him. I mean, she was getting that good homemade pie crust. Y'all know exactly what I'm talking about. This buttery, the store-bought it doesn't do it like that real homemade pie crust where the edges are not perfect. It's somebody's fingertips. That's what she was making in this video. And I'm hungry because I'm gonna be talking about a lot of food. But either way, I hope you ate yourself. Regardless, she's basically communing with her ancestor as a result of finding recipes, by him. And that's really what the advertising for genealogy looked like. It was very simple. Just connect with your ancestors, make meals like them, maybe find them in records. And in the last, probably, I would say definitely 10, maybe 12 to 15 years, advertising has shifted quite a bit, because we've gone from making recipes in that your ancestor made, to a young lady on the left, who is living in the West African nation of Benin, has never lived outside of Benin. And the young man to the right, who is her cousin, who has never lived outside of the United States. And the two of those individuals, one from Benin and one from Atlanta, meeting in Benin, and they're related. Now, how is that? If she's never left Benin and he's only lived in Atlanta, how are the two of them related? This is what technology is doing, and not for just some people or a small segment of the population. DNA is literally reconnecting families that have been torn apart since the transatlantic slave trade. Now, when I think about this, I think about how I would explain this to my grandmother. If my grandmother was still alive, she died at 99. So she'd be about 105, 106 years old at this point. How would I explain this to my grandmother? Well, the young lady on the left-hand side, her ancestors were not taken away during the transatlantic slave trade. They were not put on slave ships and sent out to the Caribbean and to the United States and all over the world. The young man on the right, his ancestor was taken on a slave ship and brought eventually to the United States. But the ancestors of both of these young folks were in the same family. That's how we get to them being connected, and finding out they're connected is because the young lady on the left took a DNA test and submitted her sample, and the young man on the right took a DNA test and submitted his sample. And by using the algorithms and the systems that compares their DNA, they discovered that they shared an amount of DNA between the two of them. And the only way that happens is if you have the same ancestors. So this is the type of stuff that is possible to do, not just with records, but also with advancements in DNA. So how do we get to that picture? Well, here's the thing. You don't have DNA without genealogy, and you don't have genealogy without DNA. And the basic definition of genealogy is that it's lineage focused. It's the study of pedigrees. It's an account of the descent of a person, family, or group, or from an ancestor or from older forms. This is the he begat, he begat, he begat, she begat, she begat. All the facty type stuff, the dates, the locations, things that we, commit to memory. Just a second ago, I was talking about my grandmother and how old she is, or how old she would be if she were still living. And that's the thing. That is information that we want, because many of us are searching to try to connect with these folks, or maybe we're even searching for their names. Having those facts and figures is a central part of genealogy, right? And those are going to serve as the building blocks for what you began in terms of your project. And you may not necessarily think that you have a project. You may have walked into this session today thinking, oh, well, I'll just go and get a little information. But I'm here to tell you that you have been summoned by those from years past to do this work. And it's likely time that you stop thinking that somebody else is going to do it for you, or that someone else in the family has got it. I hear that all the time. Oh, my cousin so-and-so has that. Well, what happens when so-and-so passes away? Does so-and-so have any children? Does so-and-so have any descendants who care about that family history? Or is it you? You don't necessarily have to be a direct descendant of that individual to take over their project. The people who started the research in my family are not my parents. They're cousins of mine. A second cousin to my mother and a first cousin to my mother. In fact, they're a whole generation separated from me on that branch that I share with Tracy. So there's no coincidence you took time out of your day to do this. And if you need any other, if you need a vote of confidence, I'm here to tell you that you are the chosen person. It's you. You don't think it is, you can continue to run from it as long as you can. But what I know about how things work is that there are going to be things placed in your path and scenarios placed in your path that are going to ensure to remind you, they're going to serve as reminders that you were the person who was chosen to do this for your family. So just want to put that little bit of information out there, just in case somebody was doubting if it was them. I'm here, let me serve as a confirmation, it is you. So here's the thing, where genealogy differs from family history is that family history is focused on the study of past events related to a group of people who are related to each other, a person's children, or a group of related people, including people who lived in the past. I like to live in family history because the dates and the locations and all that facty stuff is great, but why was that person born in Tahlequah? Why were they born in Bonita? Why is it that when we get to the 1950 census, they're no longer in those locations, they're living in Chicago? Why is it that by the time they die, they're living in Los Angeles? See, there's a lot that exists between a birth date and a marriage date and a death date. There's a dash between every single one of those dates. What was the motivation? What got them there? What were the world events that were taking place? That is family history. It's not just, and there are some folks that are very focused on getting as many greats back as they possibly can. And that's not a bad goal to have. But sometimes what happens is when you get lost in that stuff, you forget about all of these people who have these full lives that are telling you and communicating with you about certain things. And sometimes a lot of it may start with just being curious again about your surname and where it came from and how you got it. Or why is it that, if my family's living on the south side of Chicago, that there are all these other Black people from Mississippi? How is that? Well, I can tell you immediately, it's a great migration. How is it that I knew that there was a direct tie from Oklahoma to California? Is because that was the experience of my family, right? And if we really want to be real, people living in Eastern Oklahoma, they typically go right to Kansas City, either Missouri or Kansas. And if they're not there, they're in LA, or they're in Santa Barbara, or they're in Oakland, or they're in Washington State. Because that's what family history tells us. It fills in the dots as to why, right? And all of that is tied to the Great Migration. So how do you get started? Number one, the first thing I am not telling you to do is to jump online and start searching for names. And the reason why I suggest not doing that is because when you do that, you ignore the institutional knowledge that you have in your family. And not just what you have, you are ignoring the living resources that are around you that exist in your parents, that exist in your aunts and your uncles, in your grandparents, if they are still living, and cousins. You are ignoring that institutional knowledge that you all have. And yes, I'm using that big word. It's very academic, right? Maybe company knowledge, right? Think about when you work for a business. If you work for a large scale business and you work for them a number of years as an employee, you know what the mission and the vision is. You know who the leadership is. You know where you guys operate. Just about how much money comes in per year. You have a certain amount of knowledge because of your tenure or your long-standing employment with that company. And when you leave, you take that with you. Consider your family the same resource. There are folks who have never worked for the company of your family, who don't have the same knowledge about the company of your family that you and your relatives do. So you always start with you. You start with what you know personally. Who do you remember? And it doesn't even have to be in this super organized fashion. Literally write down your memories. For some people, journaling may even help, because maybe when you start to think about what you remember as a child, it starts to come out in a very visual way. And so you can take pen to paper, or we have so much technology now, you can use your phone and you can talk directly into it and it'll transcribe your words for you. So you don't have to type them out, because there may be experiences, events that you remember vividly that people were there for. And you may not necessarily remember the dates themselves as to when they happened. But if you do a little bit of research on what was going on at the time, it can direct you as to when exactly it took place. And once you start with you and write down or capture whatever you know, you also want to do that with your parents if they are still living, additional relatives, as well as what we call fictive kin. And those are people who basically are in our family, but they're not biologically related to us. I call this the proverbial Aunt Cheryl. Now, again, in our community, some people call them Cheryl, but in my family, that's going to be Cheryl. And Aunt Cheryl has been around. She was there at the repast when Papa Daddy died. Aunt Cheryl was your mama's best friend, and she knew her since she was in high school or whatever that is. And she helped with the program. Yes, the program, not a program, because there's a difference between the two. She helped with the program for your mama's service or your grandmama's service. And then Aunt Cheryl moved, and this person, again, is central to our family story, but they're not biologically related to us. But they know a lot of things that we may not have been old enough to remember, but we also can count on their perspective, because sometimes, y'all, some of these situations that crack off in our families, it is a challenge for us to have conversations about those things with people who were directly involved. Whereas when we talk to people who are in our family's orbit, like an Aunt Cheryl, right? Like a family friend, neighbor, somebody like that, they don't have the emotional attachment to it that people in our family do. And so sometimes you can get more information from them than you can the individuals within your own family. So number one, you want to start with what you know. You want to document that going back as far as you can, even a little rudimentary family tree or whatever form it takes. And then you want to reach out to your parents, your relatives, and their fictive kin, or the proverbial Aunt Cheryl. Okay, so that's in the capture step. After that, you want to gather. Again, I did not say take your tail online and start searching it, because at this point, you really don't have the proper context for who is where. Y'all know we use the same names over and over again in our families. So if you don't know which Mary it goes on which generation and all of that, no, it's not time to go online and search it. You are gonna, again, capture what you know, what your relatives know, and then you're gonna start going through your home and the home of your relatives and gathering everything up that could be of genealogical value. And that includes birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates. Just about anything can serve as a genealogical source. We walk around with one every single day, and folks don't even think about the fact that these devices are cataloging information. It'll know, again, years from now, there's a whole archive of you that exists through your mobile device that will be guiding future generations to tell them about how you lived and how you moved and what you were experiencing on a daily basis. And here's the other thing. A lot of times people hastily go online and start searching because they think, quote, everything is online. But again, not everything about your company or the business, the business of your family is online. There are certain aspects of it, especially based on the Black experience, that there was no incentive for archives and repositories to catalog our individual family stories. Yes, thank you, chat. How do funeral bulletins assist in your family research? Thank you. See, you call it a bulletin, we call that a program in our family, right? That lists out the service, the order of service, has the what we call the obituary, or some people cut the O off, the obituary, has that on one page that lists when the person was born and who the parents were, and they confessed the hope in Christ at an early age, and where they went to school, and who they married and had children with, it, who they leave behind to cherish their memory in that bottom paragraph. Think about that. I just gave you a synopsis of that person's life. So let's say you may not necessarily have a marriage license or a death certificate for that individual, or even a birth certificate. That funeral bulletin or program has told you what their life was. And let's keep it 100. Think about how maniacal some people in our families are about those programs. Like, some people get like completely turned off and like, oh my God, I don't know why this person is like asking for this to be this way. The reason why is because for us as people, that was one of the only ways we could communicate with the world about who we were, where there wasn't some other entity coming in and documenting us the way in which they envisioned who we were. That was our way of saying, this is who I am, this is what I did, and this is the mark that I left on the world. That I didn't have to be famous, but to my family, I meant something, and this is a piece of me that's being left behind. That is why those are so important, because we've been doing that before anybody was paying attention to, before the TikToks and the Facebooks and the Instagram. We were leaving our mark behind with those programs. So those are especially valuable when you're doing family history research. Pictures. I was just with my best friend yesterday, and one of her family members just gave her this trove of old photos, you all. And so many of us don't even have those photos because of, records destruction, meaning the house caught on fire, or, someone dies in your family and whoever is over their estate is going through the house and we don't need these pictures. And they just throw these things out. And I feel sort of cosmically, I guess, some of you all shuddered at the fact of people throwing away old photos, but folks do that because they don't see the value in what we're talking about. They don't see why legacy is important and why passing those things down is important. Because I'm telling you all, institutions, they had no incentive to catalog us and our experiences. And we are setting up our own library, our own institution, our own college of NED, College of Chambers, College of Atlas, College of, of Rosby. That's what we're establishing with these programs and these projects that we're doing. There's a comment in the chat. I always tell people to make sure the obituary, yeah, like how you cut it off, but that's right. How the obituary captures who the person was, what they did, bring them alive for the future generations. Absolutely, that's the whole point. So if I haven't shaken you enough to say, do not go online first, again, this is my reminder. Use the institutional knowledge in your family that's within your brains, that's within your hearts, as well as those of your ancestors, their brains, your relatives, family members, in their hearts, but also your homes. Because when someone dies, you can't get back those conversations. You can't call them and ask for details. It goes with them. There is an anecdote from Alex Haley that said that every time a person dies, it's like a library is set on fire. So please, please get the stuff that's not online first. I'll tell you one other thing about this. Last week, I was trying to find a letter, and this is a whole other story. Tracy, if you want me to come back and talk about this later, I was trying to find the letter from the National Archives that said that the FBI file for one of our cousins that I ordered was destroyed. I was trying to find the original letter because I got an email last week telling me that they had a file for that same cousin and that they had redacted all the names out of it and I could actually access it. So I was going back trying to find the original letter. Like, I know y'all told me she didn't have, that her file was destroyed. And I came across this folder that I have of all these handwritten notes from conversations that I had with people in my family over the years. Just small things like Chris, daughter, born March date. Maurice, son, born January. And literally just me on the phone with people where I wrote down the time and the date that I talked to them and the scores of folks, you all, that are no longer here that I had in those handwritten notes. It just took me back to the conversations and the people. And I'm almost emotional talking about it because I'm like, dang, at the time I thought I would always have them to call, but I don't. Now all I have is what they meant to me in my heart and what I committed to my memory that they reminded me of. But when I went back to the notes, you all, there were things that I didn't even extract off. So I implore you, I don't know who it is here that's got to call somebody, but I really need you to do that. Sometimes it also helps to send a notebook that's just for you. Order them a little notebook on Amazon and send it to them in the mail. And have them label your name on it. So as whoever that is cleaning up or doing whatever, something comes back to their memory and it's not a good time to call you, they can write it down. And then the next time you call them, ask them to go and get the notebook that's for Jacqueline. And they can say, you know what, I wrote that down because I was supposed to remember to talk to you about that. That has helped me immensely. So once we gather, right, once we collected and captured what we know, what our family knows, all the documents, then we take our tail online and go and search. Okay? And what the search is doing is it is supplementing and filling in the gaps for all of the information that does not exist in our minds and our hearts and in the paper trail we have from our homes. It is to fill in those gaps because sometimes people don't remember. Sometimes some of the facts get muddy and we're not sure. One of the top questions I get all the time is what is the best website for Black people? And there isn't a single best website, okay? But there are a couple that you can use in conjunction, as well as a third incredible option. When you put those together, that's going to give you the resources that you need to research practically anywhere in the world. Number one, it's Ancestry, okay? And I know for our community, just in working with the public, that so many folks think that Ancestry is DNA. That's it. It's, you do your DNA test. The minute you get the results, you get that cute pie chart. It tells you all the different things, and that's it. That's all Ancestry does. That is not the case. Ancestry just announced they have 40 billion with a B, 40 billion records from around the world. And the plan is to get another 15 billion on by the end of 2023. I can't even imagine. What does a billion look like? Those of you who are here on the chat, tell me what a billion looks like. I think a billion is like all the fibers of carpet in a hotel. That's what a billion looks like. That's the only thing I can even think of that even remotely resembles a billion. But in addition to Ancestry, again, not the DNA side, we're talking records. like the census, like birth, marriage, and death certificates, city directory, city yearbooks. I'm going to show you documents that you can find on Ancestry, as well as Family Search. FamilySearch.org is run by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as Mormon, the Mormons. And back in the 1930s, the Mormon Church began to go around the world and preserve records, because it is a central part of the Mormon religion is to research your ancestry and seal your ancestors back to God. It's sort of like a baptism process, okay? And the only way to do that is if you do the work of researching your family trees. It's very central to Mormonism. And of course, at the time when they started to preserve records, I mean, they were just going all over the world because they didn't know who was going to become Mormon later. And it ended up being a benefit to not just the Mormon church, but people outside of it. So some of the records you'll find on Ancestry, you'll find on FamilySearch.org, and vice versa. But sometimes, again, the dates that a collection, exists for may be one set of dates on one site and one set on the other. So you have to kind of look for that. So in addition to Ancestry and Family Search, which I'm glad Tracy pointed out, you have access to these through your public library. Ancestry is a subscription site. There is a 14-day trial. And then after that, there's a fee to access certain collections that are on the website. But there are a lot of collections that are already free and that stay free and are going to be free. In order to, accounts themselves are free, and family trees are free as well. So you can build your tree. Family Search, it's free. There's no fee associated with Family Search. You can also build a tree there. But the caveat with Family Search is that if you put a tree up there, anybody in the world who has an account can edit it. And you have no control over who edits your tree. So if somebody keeps putting bad information about your grandfather because they keep getting him confused with somebody else with the same name, you can't stop it. So that's another reason why people tend to favor Ancestry. So in addition to Ancestry and Family Search, we're going anywhere where the records are, anywhere. Sometimes that is your county or parish website. Sometimes that is a national archives, right? Or like our national archives at the main branches in Washington, D.C. They have branches all across the nation. For those of you, since we're talking Oklahoma, the regional branch of the National Archives for you all is in Fort Worth in Texas, okay? You're going to colleges, university websites, even websites that are collective of institutions that have put things together. We're going anywhere where the records are, because when you think that everything is in one place and you don't leave the confines of that actual site, you miss opportunities to learn more and to find more. And for instance, 70% of the records that are on Ancestry are just on Ancestry. But you have to think about the other 30%. Where's that stuff, right? You have to go and chase that down. So the first records that I suggest that you get started with, again, this is after you've gone through, tracking down what your family members know, gathering documents, okay? The first thing I suggest for everyone is the 1950 census. And this was released last year. Now, folks tend to think, well, wait a minute, we just did a census in 2020. Why don't we have that? Because there is a 72-year privacy hold, meaning that the census has to have happened 72 years prior in order for the public to have access to it. And that means that we're not going to get the 1960 census until 2032. So now we have another 10 years to wait for another census. And with 1950, you need to have somebody. I'm sorry, go ahead. I see you popping in, Trace. Right? She's like, am I supposed to be there or not? With the 1950 census, you want someone who was alive as of April 1st of 1950. So if the person that you're starting with, right, it could be a parent, grandparent, it could be you. You have to be, again, you've got to be alive by April 1st. That was the official census day. In fact, that still is the official census day, going forward. And you're going to search for that individual on the census. You could do this, you could start just directly from the search page on Ancestry or Family Search, or you can go directly to the 1950 census and just search that particular collection. And one of the things that I'll tell you about the 1950 census is that it's the first one that was entirely indexed by a computer. And you may be wondering what indexing is. Well, think about it. If you take a photo on your phone, your photo can, your phone can identify people's faces, right? So if you've taken a bunch of pictures of your children, it knows that that's a particular person that you take photos of. But unless you tell your phone that that is your child, William, it's not going to know the name of the person. It's just going to know the features. Well, think of indexing and genealogy as the same way. You have documents that are just digital representations of physical documents. In order for people to be able to search them, you literally have to type in manually as a person all the details that are on that so that it can be searched. And in years past with the census, literal humans had to read every line and type in all the names in order for there to be an index created that was made searchable. This time, a computer read the handwriting and did it in 9 days for the entire US Census. So they're going back and making corrections because, of course, computers have flaws and they don't read everything the same. But this is the census you want to start with. Once you find the person that's in 50, you're going to go back to 1940, 1930, 1920. And of course, at some point, that individual who's on 50 is no longer going to be on a census because they weren't born yet. But you're using the information that's on that census to track the next generation who's the oldest in the household. And you just need to make sure that, again, that's your foundational collection is US Census. Your goal is to try to get back to 1870, okay? Now, censuses began in the United States in 1790. So we have censuses from that period until, again, we just did one in 2020. Additionally, you're also going to look for vital records, that's birth, marriage, and death. Sometimes it's the certificate, sometimes it's the index of the record. So you're going to look for those. Military is a super important collection for Black folks because we've been in every major conflict in US history. A number of us descend from World War II and World War I veterans, and those draft cards provide great information. We also are going to look for anything that's out there. Like literally, I've seen the most random collections. There's one of my favorites in California that's a vocational, and it's like a vocational thing for the state of people who were applying to be barbers and beauticians. And it talks about like if she can pin curl and like all this stuff is really cute. I love that. And then I'll have a photo of the person who's applying for like the barber's or the beautician's license. There's all kinds of records. And again, the search is where you are going to fill in the blanks. Someone's like, why? Why do they have that? Because it's genealogical information. The person had to put where they were born, where they were living. Again, this is all information that is filling in the blanks for the people who are searching for them. It's great. I don't know if I'm sure I haven't seen that in any other state but California does have that. It's a really cool collection. And that's on Ancestry. So again, you're filling in the blank spaces with the information that you're gathering along the way as you're doing the searches. Again, it's just there to supplement what you don't already know or what you don't already have in your possession. And moving forward, here are some of my suggestions. You need to focus on one family line at a time, okay? Because sometimes, again, there was a whole era where Barbara was a popular name, and you might get confused between which Barbara is the right Barbara on which respective side of your family. You also, it just helps focus your research. And sometimes you kind of jump from, family branch to family branch, and that's fine. Because you might be making a lot of finds on one side and then like not on the other. So regardless, try and focus on working on one branch at a time, just to keep the confusion down. The other thing is that spelling doesn't count. And I know you are tied to the fact that, let's say there's someone here with the last name Ned, that it has 2 Ds. But one of the things that we know, especially in researching the enslavement of Black people in the United States, is that you will have a white Ned family and a Black Ned family. And the Black Neds have 2 Ds and the white Neds have 1. But the name origin comes from the exact same place. It's not that they may be biologically related. It's that one enslaved the other. And over time, to delineate between the white and the black people with the same name, one had an extra D added and the other one had one. Mind you, I haven't even talked to Jacqueline, but that could totally be a scenario. So don't get married to spelling, okay? Sort of have an amicable divorce. Kids still visit on the weekend, okay? And you have to remember, literacy rates were not where they are now. So a lot of times names will be phonetically spelled. And so that also can throw things off. And I'll talk about a little bit about some ways that you can work around this by like using things like wildcard searches, or even sounds like when you go in and search, there's a box underneath that you can toggle that on and off that can help broaden your search. So if your name has been misspelled, you can actually find it. You also want to note racial identifiers, but you don't want to be entirely tied to those. What do I mean by that? There can be records where your family is listed as mulatto, on other records just Negro or colored. Some folks grasp to this a little bit too tight, like, well, it says she's mulatto, so that means her father's white. My grandmother was on the census listed as mulatto, and it was because her mother was lighter skinned. And when I showed that to my grandmother, she was dying laughing. She was like, where? So just note racial identifiers. And what I mean by that is you can have entire Black and white families in the same community with the exact same names. And one is marked with a W, the other one is marked NEG for Negro. So you're going in to validate that you have the right people, okay? Read everything. It's very tempting when you start making finds, especially if you're on Ancestry, you're gonna get hints. It's gonna draw you in. You're gonna be there for a long time. You're gonna get sucked in. Trust me, I'm telling you, if you haven't started, you're gonna get sucked in. Wonderful place to be sucked in. But you wanna read everything. Every column, every line, even sometimes errant marks on a record can potentially tell us something. So make sure that you go through and do that, because you may be leaving some facts and family history on the table by not reading through everything that's there. And then DNA is a backup, because sometimes what happens is the family history that we have in our brains and in our hearts is not what is biologically our family history. Sometimes we find out that parents are not who we were told they were, or who our parents were told they were, or who our grandparents were told they were. And so what the DNA does is it validates your traditional genealogy research. And I don't see any questions in the chat here. I want to stop for just a second before we start going into records to ask if there are any in the room, since I can't see.
Yes, this is Norma. You mentioned that when we're looking at census records, we need to go back how far to the first census? You said 17 something, I think.
1790, right, yeah, right, 1790. But here's the caveat. While Black folks and people of color have been on the census since 1790, you will not find the names of the enslaved on the census.
When did they start coming on?
Now, so we don't start in mass appearing on the United States Census until after the Civil War. So that's 1870 and further, because the Emancipation Proclamation 1863, but that only freed enslaved people in certain states. Other counties in certain states were exempted. So the 13th Amendment is technically what ended slavery and freed everybody. That was ratified in January of 1865. So the first census we have after that is in 1870. Now, if you descend from free people of color, meaning individuals who were manumitted or emancipated by their slaveholders, or by state law, depending on where you live, they will appear on the federal census prior to 1870, and they will have a race marked, because white was the default. They did not make a mark to put W, but they would put, C for colored. And so that's an unfortunate aspect of having to research formerly enslaved people, is the fact that we do not appear on the census. You guys may have seen records like the slave schedules used on popular television shows, but that's really a census of slave owners. And we'll talk a little bit more of that in a little bit. What if you don't have original records like vital records? That is totally fine. Still go through the process of putting down what you know, and then you're probably going to start the search online a little bit earlier than other people. But I would say if you don't have the records, remember, connect with your family members because some of them may have things that you don't necessarily know. Is there anything in the room, Trace?
You actually answered somebody's question who's here in the room. Does anybody else have any questions for Nicka so far?
She said the next thing she was gonna go over records.
Yes.
Mine was-
Okay. We do have one question, two questions.
Did she say she was
Okay.
gonna put the slate schedule so we'll know exactly how that works?
Did you hear her question?
Correct. Yep. Yeah. We're gonna go over that in just a second.
Okay, we have one more question in the back.
What if someone's birth record said they're white and they're actually black?
Could you hear her?
Yes, I heard that. That did happen. We have a cousin who was listed as white on a marriage license, and when I showed it to her, she laughed herself almost to the point where she wet herself. That does happen. And sometimes you have birth certificates that don't even have a race. My grandmother in Oklahoma, because hers was delayed, meaning it was not issued when she was born, so she had to apply for one later. She did not mark a race on hers at all. So that's, again, that's subjective, depending on who was filling the information out. It's just, you have to control for human error. But if you know that person lived their lives as a white person, then you're gonna look for them as white. Or y'all know how people passed. There might be a certain time period. There might be a certain time period where they white and when they black.
We have another.
Right. Right. I have a peanut gallery here. They still might be walking around passing. Correct.
We have another question in the room.
Okay.
Okay.
I do know that there was a fire that just got rid of a lot of records. Are you going to talk about that and how you can circumvent the fire that happened that erased a lot of records?
Yeah, so for courthouse destruction or even destruction in your own family, like a family home, there's a few things you could use. You could go to the surrounding counties that weren't destroyed, or you can pivot into federal records for that time period. Because remember, cities have records, states have records, the federal government has records. And one of the ways, again, especially for researching the slavery era that we have, because again, so many courthouses were burned during the Civil War, is when we pivot into like the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a federal collection, Civil War pensions, federal, because that stuff wasn't destroyed. So you basically just, go to the other levels of government in that area if they exist, or go to the surrounding areas to see if you can find stuff. All right, we ready to jump into some records so we can start talking about this? Is that possible? Yeah, military records are going to be federal, right? You are going to have some stuff that's local, like when you have to go and file your separation. You had to go to the actual courthouse to file your separation papers. You're going to have that documented. And sometimes they have other stuff too. I've seen enlistments at a county or parish level. They have that stuff too. Yep. Now, there was a big fire at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, which is over our military records, but don't let that, that's not everything. Everything didn't go up in a towering inferno. This proves the reason why you should have copies of stuff in multiple places. That's the whole reason why I put together our family history book, was because we had a big fire in my grandmother's childhood home, and the people and my grandmother and her siblings did not go and get the family Bible out, even though their father said, come get it. They didn't go and get it, and it had burnt up. And I didn't want that to ever happen in our family history. So I put together a book. So now there are hundreds of copies all over the world. And if anything happens to what I have, we know there's a copy somewhere else. All right. So here's a quick reminder, because I often hear people say, oh, I want to trace my family back to Africa, and, thinking that phenomenon exists, right, with just one branch of your family. And that's not true. What you have to control for is that every generation in your family, the number of your ancestors doubles. By the time you get to your great, 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 great grandparents, that's 64 different people. As in 6-4. And slavery, based on how generations fall in your family, starts at different generations. For me, my enslaved ancestors start to pop up at my great great grandparent level. That means my grandparents' grandparents were enslaved. For some people, your great grandparents may have been enslaved. But when we get back to that time period here, right, at the 16 great great grandparents, if they're descending from 32 people for us, and those folks come from 64, when you're trying to trace back to Africa, you may be going to 64 different places. Maybe 20 of them are in Ghana, or 20 of them are in Nigeria, or 15 of them are in Cameroon. But they might not even be from the exact same spot in those places. So we really, truly, those of us who are stateside, African American, Black, we are really, truly African diasporans because we're spread across multiple ethnicities and people. And just up to your great, 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 great grandparents, your 4 times great grandparents, that's 124 different people coming just specifically from you and your siblings and your first cousins, everyone that's on that generation. So it should be your goal to try to get back to these 4 times great grandparents, because for many of us, for me, my transatlantic slave trade people, the people who will survive the transatlantic slave trade, starts at my 4 times or 5 times great grandparents. And that sounds like that was a long time ago, but really in relative time, it was not at all. That's how close we are to those slave ships, you all. Now, let's move into some records, because I know you want to see some things and you guys probably have questions, and we're going to be wrapping up in a second. But many Americans spend a lot of time wanting to get to a list like this. This is a manifest list for individuals who are immigrating into the United States, into New York. And this is from 1906. And you get a number of different things off of this list, like the person's name, who is the immigrant, their occupation, whether they are literate, where they're from in terms of their nationality. Note it even says race or people. You also have where they last lived, where their final destination is, who paid for them to come on this trip, how much money they had in their pockets, whether they were ever in the United States at any point in time, whether they're going to join a relative or a friend who was already there. Then they have what I call the cockamamie questions, like, are you a polygamist or anarchist? Then they start talking about mental and physical capabilities, whether people have, quote, deformed or crippled nature or length of time and cause. All of that is captured on this document. So when people have that whole image of their ancestor coming in on the ship, passing by the Statue of Liberty, that proverbial shot we got in any movie with the immigrants, you're gonna see the child on the ship, the parents on the ship, passing through and looking at Lady Liberty. This is the list that would have been created once that person disembarked from that ship. And again, this is 20th century migration, right? Story we all hear. But here's the bad news. A full and accurate collection of these things, exact same stuff I'm telling you about, does not exist for the formerly enslaved. No, it is done in part. More likely what you're going to find is an iteration of the document you just saw with all the names on it, but it doesn't have names at all. You've got to put, again, when you're tracing history, you're going back, you're trying to get to 1870 or even before, you've got to think about it from the vantage point of people not being people before the law and being property. And typically, we were only documented when there was a financial incentive for the people who were documenting us or who the transaction involved. So what do we have? Well, I talked a little bit about the slave schedules, and you may have seen these in popular programs where they may say, this is probably your ancestor. And the reason why they use qualifying language like that is because the slave schedules is a census of slaveholders. The slave schedules was done in 1850 and 1860. Now, while enslaved people have always been counted on the census, they were never, again, I'm thinking of Pasture Manifest, never all directly named. And Congress wanted to specifically set out to get demographical data on enslaved people outside of just numbers for them, and even buckets, which was done previously. Slaves age 5 to 10, 14 to 28, right? They wanted specific data that was better than that. In 1850, right? That was the first time they did it again in 1860. And you see on this slide where it says name of slave owners, that actually in the draft stage said name of slave. But an argument broke out on the floors of our Congress. And a man who was a senator named Andrew Pickens Butler from South Carolina said, and I quote, "The census heretofore taken has only required the numbers of the slaves, and I see no useful information the obtaining the names can afford. On a plantation where there are 1, 2, or 300 slaves, there are perhaps several of the same name who are simply known by some familiar designation on the plantation. It can afford no useful information and will make a great deal of labor." But if you pay attention to this document, you see that they got the age, the gender identity, and the race of those folks. So how much extra work was it to actually just write their name? And our Congress decided not to write their names down and to give the instruction to the enumerators, because see, remember back in this time period, they weren't sending census forms to homes. There were, in fact, before 1880, US Marshals were going around and writing down who were in households on the census, going door by door and getting that information. And they said, we don't need the names, we just need their data. Sound familiar? We don't need their names, we just need their data. And that decision was made again in 1860. Now, there are extremely rare circumstances where the census enumerators actually wrote down the names of the enslaved on the slave schedules, but that is very few and far between. The vast majority, there are no names on the slave schedules. There aren't. And I show you this particular slave schedules. Again, you see at the top, it says slave inhabitants of the District of Edgefield in South Carolina, because the man that argued that we shouldn't put the names down was in fact the slave owner himself. He enslaved 64 people, and this is a part of his slave schedules from 1850. So how do we trace enslaved people? If there is no list, right? There's no national list. There is no central repository like slavery.com that we can go in and put a name in. How do we find enslaved people? We go back to the basics. Again, using the documents. We start with things like deeds and conveyances, right? If you own property, or if you need to transfer property from one individual to another, you're going to go and get that transaction documented at the courthouse. And enslaved people were transacted. This is a deed where a man named Richard Butler is conveying enslaved people to a man named Israel Trask. And you'll note in yellow, it says Negro men slaves, Cook, Ben, Dick, Tom, Hardy, Frank, Peter, Charles, Jake, and the Negro women slaves, Sophia, Charlotte, Zuiga, Coelho, Kawamba, and the children slaves, Jack, Sophia, and Lucy. Some of you may have been told, oh, slaves aren't in records. You can't find them. But there are millions of pages, and I'm not exaggerating. Millions of pages just like this across the world, actually, that document transactions just like this. Now, in addition to deeds and conveyances, you also have what are called probates and successions. And those exist when a person dies and has property and needs to leave said property to their living descendants. And within a probate or a succession is a will, but sometimes there's not always a will, an inventory of property. You've got meetings, family meetings, you've got disputes, there's minutes, there's all kinds of stuff. But within those documents, again, if the person was a slaveholder, you're going to see the names of enslaved people on things like this inventory. At the top, it says item 2, Negroes. In this scenario in yellow, you see King, age 55 years, and his wife Rachel, age 55 years, William, age 19 years, and for Andrew, age 15 years, with a value of $4,500. And that is not the amount of money that King and Rachel and William and Andrew stood to receive from this succession or probate. That's their monetary value to the estate. And everybody that's listed underneath that with dollar values associated, connected to their names, again, that's not money that they are getting. That's how much value, monetary value, was placed on them. And if folks are saying, if you're thinking, oh, well, this is needle in a haystack, no, it's not, because when we started this call, we talked about a group of cousins who were here that are related to me. And me and Tracy, these are my 3rd great-grandparents, King and Rachel. These are her 4th great-grandparents. William, who was 19, is Tracy's great-great-great-grandfather. Kyra, who was here, this is her husband's great-great-grandfather, Andrew. If you keep going down this page and you see little King, age 22, that's my great-great-grandfather. These records don't just exist in the United States. One of the things we also have to remember is timelines and history, and you're going to be spending a lot of time Googling and reading books to try to understand what was going on in various areas. One of the things that I think a lot of folks stateside do not know was that slavery ended in British colonial dependencies, meaning countries that were colonized by Britain, a whole 30 years before it ended in the United States. And those former colonial dependencies have slave registers that exist from 1813 to 1834. And this one in particular is from Trinidad in the year of 1834. There are also lists just like this that list the slaveholders and the name of the plantation. And even on this one, you see you get the height of the enslaved person. You see they have actual surnames because people think that enslaved people did not have surnames, and they did. Note how many of these enslaved people are listed as dead. Now, these registers exist in Antigua, Bahamas, Barbados, Berbice, Dominica, Grenada, Honduras, Jamaica, Mauritius, Nevis, Sri Lanka, St. Christopher, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Tobago, Trinidad, the Virgin Islands. More documents. Ship manifests. Remember, we looked at one for immigrants coming over during the early 20th century, but we do have a large collection, it's not complete, of ship manifests for enslaved people. And these are not individuals who are being brought over from Africa. This is after the importation ban on enslavement, like meaning you couldn't bring slaves directly over from Africa anymore. You could not import them, it was illegal. And in order to delineate between when individuals were being taken by ship, right? Enslaved people being taken using the water, you had to claim your enslaved people and say, no, I already have them in my possession. I'm not illegally bringing them in from Africa. And this, hold on just a second. All right. And this is an example from Mobile, Alabama. This is a young woman, 21 years of age, named Esther, who is 5 feet tall, who is the enslaved of a man named George Little, who's living in Alabama, and he is sending her from Mobile to New Orleans, which is not that long of a ride. But again, because it's on the water, you have to claim you're enslaved. There's a little boy that's with her as well, who's 4 years old. And you see they put Black for the mother, and or look, I believe this might be his mom. It may or may not be. and mulatto for the little boy. Another set of collection of records that document the formerly enslaved, where you can get the actual names of their slaveholders, are the Freedmen's Bureau. This is a list of rations for individuals who were in, this is in St. Mary Parish, Louisiana. And note in red with the circle around it, it says name of former owner. Right. The individuals in yellow are 100 years old in 1867. So if you do the math, those two people were born before the founding of the United States. And here they are getting rations for the Freedmen's Bureau. One man, John Prudhomme, is not enslaved because you see, or, wasn't enslaved at the time, or, didn't emerge from the time of enslavement with the slaveholder. But a woman named Betsy Theriot, who's 100 years old, was enslaved by a man named Emilion Melangon. And she's 100 years old. For free people of color, a lot of places by law, they had to register as such. And if they did not come and register, they could potentially either be re-enslaved or kicked out of the area that they were living in. This is a certificate of freedom for a woman named Fluvella Gaither. She was 29 years of age. It goes in to talk about her complexion, what she looks like, and that her certificate was granted on the affidavit of someone named James Newton on July 16th of 1860. You can also find ancestors who were born in Africa on the census. It'll actually tell you their birth location. This is the 1870 census I've been talking about, which is the first one that documents everyone in theory in the United States. And this is for a woman named Katie Dunbar. She's 90 years of age, putting her date of birth at 1780, and note that her birthplace is listed as Africa. Now you're probably thinking, well, where, right? It's a continent. A lot of times they did not document where. They didn't. So, but we can potentially use DNA and maybe other records to fill in the gaps as to where in Africa. Still trying to find that myself. Now we're in Oklahoma, so of course we have to talk about Native American research. We can do an entire session on Freedmen of the Five Tribes, but this is an example of a Dawes card. This is one of the seminal documents that you would use to connect back to the respective nations, being the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole Nation. And this is actually a rejected card. People think that if your ancestor was rejected by the Dawes Commission, that's it, all hope is lost, there's nothing there. But that's actually not true, because Dawes records are full of genealogy information. And this is a Dawes record for a man named William Van, who was 104 years of age. And while he was rejected for the Trail of Tears, when you go to a companion document, or rejected for the Dawes Commission, when you go to a companion document that ties to this, is the Dawes application, you will find out that he was on the Trail of Tears with his slaveholder. And if you zoom in, you'll actually see on this document, it says slave of right there. And it's not just for him, it's also, there's a back part of this card that includes the information of who the slaveholder was for his parents. These records are specific to freedmen of the five tribes. They do not exist outside of that group. Now, I see you, Tracy. Oh, I can't hear you. Okay.
She needs to unmute herself.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Trace.
The question was verifying the word Dawes.
Yeah, D-A-W-E-S. And these are on Ancestry. Yep, D-A-W-E-S, and on Fold3, which is still an Ancestry website. Let's see, more records. Again, we're looking at stuff all across the world, okay? Because some people don't have stateside research. Some people are in the Caribbean. This is an example of a marriage from Jamaica. This is Calvin Rudolph McCullough marrying Millicent Straker. Both of them were living in Kingston, Jamaica, and note on this little marriage register, it notes the name of their fathers. and that they got married in Kingston on, it looks like Tuesday, December 7th, 1915. Military, love draft cards. These are my absolute favorite. I just love these because not only can you find out things like the height and the weight of the person, you can find out who their next of kin was, where they were working, you can see their signature. If somebody was missing a finger or had an arm cut off, it would say that. It's all kinds of random stuff. This is one for a man named John Roosevelt White, but this is for World War II. But note, he's born in New Orleans, but he's living in San Jose, California. So these are great documents to see the Great Migration. But he's working on University Avenue in Palo Alto, which I've walked on that street so many times because I went to school in this area. So another cool document. This is an example of the 1950 census that just came out. So this is what the households would look like. And some of you are like, oh my gosh, all this handwriting. The majority of the stuff you're going to be looking at is going to be handwritten. This is for a man named Lambert Dunn, who is living, I believe he's in New Orleans, and he's a tractor driver at a sugar manufacturer. But there's his wife Viola, his son Roosevelt, the other son Paul, Leola, Florence, Olivier, or could be Oliver, depending on who you ask. Then there's Lamont Jr. and Ruzy, and then there's Thomas. And note, it's for Thomas, it doesn't have an age. It says Og. That means that that child was born between 1949 and April 1st of 1950. So because they put Og, that means the child was born in August of 1949. You see how you just don't just have an age and a year, you're actually getting, this census is one that does that. Yearbooks. Ancestry has the largest collection of yearbooks in the world. And it's not just white schools, it's Black schools. There's Miss Pat Lewis, with her wonderful hair just to the side. And she's the commissioner of the Finance Committee, along with Jan Carpenter, Helene Crawford, Inez Randall, Shirley Willis, Lucy Hardy, Geraldine Avery, and Annette Richards. You will find stuff like that as well. Newspapers. I love newspapers. I feel like not enough genealogists actually use newspapers. This is an example of a cousin of mine from Oklahoma who, believe it or not, moved to Buffalo, New York, and was fluent in Spanish and would be utilized in the high school plays in Spanish-speaking roles as a grown man. I only found this out because I found it in the newspaper. So there's cousin Luther Martin, was it the American Businessman in Cuba. Now, we're going to touch on DNA briefly. I just want to tell you that do not go and get your admixture percentages like what you're looking at tattooed anywhere, because they're going to shift and change. As the algorithm happens, things are going to shift. So on the left-hand side, you see what my admixture percentages were some time ago. And then on the right, you're actually looking at what they are now. And you'll notice that Ivory Coast and Ghana has gone down significantly for me, but Nigeria is now the largest percentage of where my ancestry is, followed by Cameroon, Congo, and Western Bantu. And then Scotland is right underneath that. And for most Black folks, one of the biggest realizations that they're going to come to is the fact that we all have a sizable amount of European DNA. And it doesn't necessarily have to be as a result of slavery. In my experience, in my family, those relationships happened after slavery. And some of them were in states where it was entirely legal. So don't make the assumption that it's always because of slavery and rape and all of that. It may not necessarily be that story. Why does it change over time? It's because the refinements get better. Their pool of where they're connecting your DNA to, it gets like more people test, it gets better and more accurate. So that's the reason why it shifts. Now, when you're testing with a company like Ancestry or 23andMe, you're going to get these updates free. Other companies, they may make you pay in order to get updates, but with Ancestry and 23andMe, you do not. But I also want to point out a feature that's on Ancestry is what's called DNA communities. With those percentages that I just showed you, those are within the last 2,000 years of my unique family history. But with DNA communities, it's with the last 150 to 200 years. And you see, it's telling me exactly where. In the US, early Virginia, Mississippi and Louisiana African Americans. And when you click on these in your browser, it'll actually take you to the map as to where this actually is. When you're looking at this one for Louisiana, Mississippi African Americans, that literally is the Mississippi Delta where 3 of my 4 grandparents were from. So that's super accurate. So if you've done Ancestry DNA, scroll down to the bottom of your DNA story page to find out what your DNA communities are. And many people don't even realize that this is there. All right. Any more questions?
Okay, we have a question. Go ahead. Who?
Okay.
You didn't mention in records obituaries, so, or is that something that you don't really consider helpful? Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have one week here right now. So, okay. And is there a website that, like, is better than others for looking at, like, obituaries and grave sites and things like that?
So, yeah, so if we're talking about burials in particular, Find a Grave, I think still has the largest number of burials. These are folks who have actually gone into the community who are photographing headstones and cemeteries, and then they upload them and put them online. So you've got that. In terms of funeral programs, there have been some libraries that have put together programs where they have the community bring in programs and they'll scan them and put them into a database or even into binders and stuff that people can use. But there is no like central spot for like those old obituary programs. Some of that has to be regional. Sometimes the mortuary will keep, the actual local mortuary will keep some on hand. But it's not, like it's not there's no like blackpeoplefuneralprograms.com. That doesn't exist. That doesn't exist. So usually there's usually a funeral maven in your family. The funeral maven in my family was my grandma. That was her. That's how I knew I made it as a genealogist, is when she gave me her program. Like I was like, I must be doing something, because granny be at funerals for people she don't even know. And and she was just, I'm like, why does she do that? But there's just certain people that are just like that about death. So yeah, so I would suggest that definitely Find a Grave. If you start a tree on Ancestry, Find a Grave hints will come in. So if somebody's buried and the burial is on Find a Grave, it'll show up as a hint for you. You don't even have to look for it. It'll just show up as a hint.
We have another.
Oh, there's
question.
one in the chat.
Oh,
okay. We'll get to in the room right after we go to the chat person.
Okay.
Where do you mention we can find slave registers for the Caribbean? I'm looking for Montserrat. Okay, so for Montserrat and for the Caribbean, you want to make sure that you drill down on Ancestry, because it's going to pretty much default. It's going to default to all collections, which is across the world. But you specifically want to narrow it down to North America, or because it's continental. Or even drill down into specific registers that are, or records that are for Montserrat. So on the search page, at the very bottom, you can toggle between North America and the Caribbean, like a USA and North America, which will bring in the Caribbean. And with Caribbean islands, the chain of dependency, or whoever was colonizing them during the period of enslavement will dictate who would have those slave registers. And I could have sworn that Montserrat was under the Dutch, but I might be wrong. That's a Googleable thing that I would do to find out where that is. All right, in the room question.
in the room.
Our family, my grandmother's grandmother, her mother, I believe that they said that her name is Bims, and we know that the Bims is from Africa, but we don't know which part.
Could you hear the question?
Yes, she said her grandmother was born in Africa, but you don't know which part. And you're trying to figure out where?
Yeah, that. And another question is, her last name was Bims, and for some reason, I don't know the spelling of Bims.
Bims was the surname.
Okay. And this is a like grandmother, not a great great grandmother.
It was my grandmother's mother.
Great grandmother.
So it would be a great grandmother. Okay. So there's a few things. Since you're in the room with me talking, I'm trying to gauge your age. I will not ask you that question. And I cannot see you. But since you're in the room with me, that individual likely had to go through an immigration process because it's 20th century. So you will be looking for like naturalizations, which that information is online for several states. Like, did they come through New York, San Francisco, where you're going to actually see the, petition for naturalization. It's going to, it's going to list where they were born and where they came from. Similar to kind of like that manifest I was telling you about. But if it's further back than that, where our immigration process isn't, what we're doing currently, you can you can potentially do DNA. And if you look at your DNA matches and you have people from that respective area, then you can connect with them. But the thing is Africa is a continent made up of many countries. And so the other thing you have to control for is whether or not the country she is from is judicious with records availability. Like, do they make things available outside of that country? Because there are several places that are not, they're not open to family search or ancestry or any entity coming in and making copies of their stuff. You have to actually go there and do research. Like Cuba is one of those places that it's almost impossible to research there online. You really need to go there in person and do research. All right, there is another question here in the chat. My first generation of family members have passed. I'm working on info my aunt gave me. Can I count on my gut to locate family, or should I get my DNA to continue searching? If you're comfortable with doing DNA, I would suggest that absolutely. Because that's really how we're finding new folks, is people who are just on the edge of, starting to dive into their family history, but don't maybe have the resources or don't have the skills to be able to drill down and get the information. Or maybe they are like you and they don't know. And that's a way that you guys can kind of, build a bond working together to find information. So yeah, I would do it, and I would test at the two largest companies, which are 23andMe and Ancestry. Ancestry is over 23 million people tested. And in addition to you getting your pie chart in those communities that I was telling you about, there's DNA matching. And if you opt into that, it will give you a degree of relatedness to the other people who have tested. So for instance, me and Tracy are DNA matches, obviously, because we come from the same people. But if we didn't know who those ancestors were, we would have to do the work on our respective trees to find out where our trees cross or where our ancestors are the same. And based on the amount of DNA that we share, naturally, if I didn't already know Tracy, I would be like, oh, okay, so I've got my mom in common with her. That means that she's a connection to me on my mother's side. All right, now through my grandparents, which one? My mother's mother or my mother's father? Well, if I see other cousins on my mother's side in common with us, oh, that tells me it's my grandma. All right, now from her parents, is it her mother's side or her father's side? Well, I've got cousins on the dad's side that are showing up in common. That tells me it's going to the atlases. That literally is taking me to where I needed to get to, if we did not know already. And that's really what you're doing, is a process of elimination with DNA matches. And it's especially effective for researching enslavement, where you don't have any clues on where to start.
For some of us.
One more question.
Who participate people, is it a company that you would recommend that we could go and just, they can start the process or they can finish the process? For us, like Oprah wanted to did that show once and they did all hers. Like, is there anyone reputable that could do the process for me if I gave them the information to like my great grandmother?
Right. So there are independent folks that do genealogy research. I used to, and several of the people that I know used to. but folks wore them out during the pandemic. And I think one of the reasons why that happened, is because folks are very short-sighted and think that they're going to show up at a table with a book with Henry Louis Gates. That's not how it works. You know, he's not gonna come in on his cane in the room and like walk and the whole wall's gonna open up. It's a process. And it takes months, if not a year or so, to even get the book and the documents that they are showing you on the show. And people think it goes by very quickly, and it doesn't. And with that said, with folks, you know, with not having expectations, you know, properly like set, it's not where I'm going to spend this amount of money this one time and that's going to last for however long. Like, it's going to be exhausted. So yeah, that's the thing. Folks wore people out. I hate to say it, y'all. I don't even have anybody I refer people to, because everybody has stopped doing individual research because people have burnt them out. Now there are services that exist like progenealogists at Ancestry. If you go to the top of the page or in the navigation, there's an option to connect with them. They have a whole intake form. You know, granted, it's not cheap. Even with, you know, in onesie twosie people, or even with progenealogists, it's not cheap. I think with them, it's like, I think it starts at $3,000. Right. There's a question in the chat. How do you find the lineage from my great grandfather? Well, it's the same process I just outlined. You're going to go based off of generation. You're going to use the skills and get the cookie crumbs from those that, you know, that you left off on, to see what you can get. You have information you can extract from them to get back to the prior generation. And sometimes it's bringing together a host of documents. For instance, with our family, I knew when I was trying to find our slaveholder, I was like, okay, well, let me look at all the brothers that we all descend from. Where were they born? That might help me pinpoint where they may have been enslaved. Well, that was a crapshoot, because one son is born in Mississippi, the other one says Arkansas, the other one says Louisiana. That's 3 different states. In like 4 years, they're living in 3 different states. Now, as an enslaved person, that is totally possible. But the reason why there was confusion over where they were born was because their slaveholder died. And the children, the brothers, were young. So you got to remember, they couldn't read or write. They were reliant largely on what other people were telling them. So of course, where they were born was all over the map, because there was confusion. So once I found the story of what happened with them when they were enslaved, it made all the sense of the world why there was confusion over where they were born. And while one census said this, and another one said that, another one said that. So it's the sum of all the parts. And sometimes it may take us time to get that. And some of that comes in just new records being released, just having that one little piece of information that you need to be able to make the next step.
I want to put a plug in. I'm going to show, we have this book on display. Who Do You Think You Are? Have you all seen this show? It's on NBC. Last year, we held our family reunion in New Orleans, and Nicka dropped a whole bunch of information we didn't know about. She kept it a surprise. And she actually, the first episode of the newest season that premiered last July, she was featured on the show and interviewed Billy Porter. So if you have access to go back and watch that, it was amazing. And like she mentioned about finding your roots, that was filmed, I think you mentioned, a year prior to it being aired on TV. So she kept it all on the down low. We didn't even know. And it was just amazing to watch that episode. It was very emotional. And, you know, Billy Porter was just amazing. So if you get a chance to go back and watch that, you'll see Nicka featured on that. Also, she did a documentary, which I'm going to show at the end of the session if you want to stay and watch it, which kind of ties up a lot of what she taught us this morning. So don't throw away those Bibles, letters, pictures. You may find something in the middle of a Bible, like a letter, or a note, it may not make any sense, but as you're doing research, it may tie to a family member. And I have learned so much just even this presentation, which this isn't the first presentation I've heard of Nicka's, but I always learn something. And I hope that you all did learn something today that you can go back when you're driving home like, oh, I know that Granny had some records. Or when my grandmother passed away, a lot of stuff got dispersed amongst uncles and cousins. But there are still some stuff at her house because my uncle still lives in the house. So I know I can go and when I visit California and go to my grandmother's house, and I know there's some things still there. So, think about those places. People hide stuff in bookshelves and shelves and in closets, suitcases, all of it. So, so I hope everybody enjoyed themselves this morning. I'm going to let Nicka close the program out. If anybody on the chat has any other questions, jump in. Nicka mentioned the event she's doing in Tahlequah. I will put that in the chat if anybody is interested in attending, and I will share that also with you. We are having a program in June. Nicka will be back. She's going to do a presentation on Juneteenth, and that will be June the 3rd. Yay. Also in August, the next program we have planned, which I'm really, really excited about, the special collection librarian for our library system, Lisa, is here today, and we met with Nicka, and we've decided to do a program because it's the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the Cherokee Nation. So that program will be August the 6th. Nicka will be here in person, yay, so you can all meet her and get her autograph. And we have some other plans for that program besides her presentation, but I'm really excited about that program as I'm meeting other people who come into the library. And I'm happy to meet all of you. Those of you who came in late, I'm the manager here at the library, and I was really excited to bring this program this morning because I think these are things we need to know about our history. I've heard a lot of people say our children don't know. I'm sure your spouse doesn't know. And maybe your parents didn't share some of those stories, and it just takes that curiosity, to start thinking about, yeah, I wonder where in Mississippi did, my parents come from. Don't give up on, write all your questions down. I mean, no question is a dumb question. It may lead you somewhere you didn't even know. And you may find out information like I did when Nicka looked at my DNA results, and she called me and she said, I don't think anybody else in our family has this percentage. You're the only one. And I'm like, what does that even mean? Because we're all part Native American, as we're told, as I was too. Well, it turns out that Native American percentage was from Mexico. So I have an ancestor from Mexico. I mean, it just blew my mind because all my matches on Ancestry, a lot of them are from Mexico of Hispanic descent. So Nicka is helping me try to figure where that tie is. So I can't give up. Every now and then I have to bug her and say, I don't know if this is a lead or not. So just don't give up on the things that you find out. I mean, it may be trivial, but it may be important down the road. Okay, I'm going to let Nicka close out. And again, I want to thank everyone for coming. Nicka, I'll turn it over to you to finalize everything. Oh, thanks for sharing that in the chat.
Yeah, I put the link there again. If you all are there local, definitely come and check out the two events if you can. I know it's way up in BFE for y'all.
Yeah, Tahlequah is far.
Driving out to the country, but yeah, thank you all for spending your time with me this Saturday. I hope again that there's something that you can take away from this presentation that can help you in your own genealogy research pursuits. And even if it's just to start conversations amongst people in your family about this information. I'm extremely aware of efforts that are being made across the nation, for atonement programs, and the fact that the information we're talking about, a lot of people are going to start seeking it out to try to validate, trying to get money and resources for several things. And I don't want folks to get discouraged because, folks aren't there for whatever folks would deem the right reasons. We should be doing this work regardless of if there's anything attached to it, because we all have legacies and we have people we descend from, and they don't have to be famous. They don't have to have done anything notable. They lived and survived so that we could be literally sitting in a room together on a Saturday talking about them, or in a virtual space with boxes talking about them. Just their very existence in our nation and our world is something to be heralded. And some of their names have not been spoken for years. So give life to who they were by virtue of you looking for them. All right, have a great day.
Thanks, Nicka.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good day.
Thanks.